So today I have the pleasure of speaking with Joseph Pold. I met Joe through some common work we're currently doing for the Journal for Medical Internet Research, or JMIR. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Joe is the head of marketing insights and analysis at JMIR Publications, based out of Philadelphia. He received his bachelor's degree in geology in 2016 from the University of Pittsburgh, and then began his career as an editorial intern at John Wiley and Sons. Did I get that right?
We just call it Wiley, but yeah.
Okay, cool. So there he worked for several years, eventually becoming the Editorial Program Coordinator. He also worked for Springer Nature as an associate editor, and then began his position at JMIR this year. So Joe is very involved in the research community. A simple scroll through his, and the publication community, I should say, a simple scroll through his LinkedIn posts showcases that passion very evidently. Today we'll be discussing some of Joe's research during the pursuit of his undergraduate degree, specifically pertaining to sewage pipe service density in relation to demographic factors in Pittsburgh. With this, I hope that Joe can discuss some of the more narrow scoped research that may be optimal for those interested in making their first try at a research endeavor. I'm also, just a bit of a going off script here, I'm also hoping that maybe we can have a bit of conversation about the publishing process a little bit, that many students might not be familiar with, many viewers might not be as familiar with getting into research. So I really can't wait to see where this conversation goes. And welcome to the podcast, Joe.
Thanks for having me, Ben. I have to say that I am also have a certification in geographical information systems, which is really only relevant, not so much professionally anymore, but in relation to the research that I used to do when I was an undergrad, it was very much focused around using GIS tools. So Esri, the Esri ArcGIS suite, if you guys are familiar with that. And yeah, always happy to talk about kind of the research process itself. Sort of one of my personal missions has always been to sort of illuminate what, as I discovered when I got into publishing, is oftentimes kind of like a black box system for a lot of people. And, my personal opinion is it seems to be very much intentionally designed that way. And so, talk about some of my work at JMIR as well, about how it works kind of outside of that system. But yeah, just broadly speaking, happy to talk about all things science. I ended up in publishing, as you said, I'm sure you talked to a lot of researchers outside of myself. I was at the point in my career I got into publishing, which is, a fairly obscure industry for a lot of people, where I knew that I wanted to do something that was involved with science. But I was quite burnt out from schoolwork, and I didn't necessarily know about what I wanted to do with such intensity that I felt comfortable throwing tens to hundreds of thousands of dollars at it in the next 2 to 6 years of my life at it. So publishing was a really interesting way to sort of stay involved with the research cycle, make sure you feel like you're doing something to sort of move the needle there without having to necessarily bury my head in a wet lab or whatever the heck it might be for the next umpteen years. And it didn't really start with a direction, and here we are today. So,
well, research is sort of scary, and I think that's something that I think people don't really fathom until they actually finish the research. And it's like, okay, like I know with myself, it's like, okay, we finished this paper, and it's like, okay, this gets published, and this is science, right? Like, this is science. It's like I don't want to say it's the truth, but it's like it's considered part of like the scientific body, if you want to say that, right?
Yeah, it's part of the literature.
And so literature, exactly. And it's really scary, it's like you have to be like, I guess, pardon my language, you have to be very damn sure that what you're writing is true, right? And you want to make it as true as you can possibly make it, and as factual as you can make it. And it's never going to be perfect, right? And so there's a lot of these sort of freaky things when you're publishing or when you're researching like that, right? Yeah, it's a weird field. So I totally get that if you don't know, right? If you don't really, you don't want to continue paying money, and of course it's very expensive to research, right? That's not you need to find funding, or you need to fork up some money,
or find someone who likes you enough who has that funding.
Yeah. So actually, why don't we start there? Research wise, what do you what would you suggest people who are interested in research, where should they go first? So people, they've never tried doing any research before, they say they're beginning undergraduate studies, or say finishing off high school, whatever it may be. Where do they go? Who do they talk to? And what what would be their first steps?
Yeah, I think you touched on something that's very important prior to this, which is sort of like almost the imposter syndrome of like, particularly if you are an undergrad, I don't have the fancy, the DR, the fancy, the PhD, the MS, whatever it might be behind my name. How do I know that I'm good enough to be part of the literature, right? It's a real fear I'm sure a lot of people run into. And, you know, to be completely honest, that's why I am not a published author. I ran into that. I'd done work that I was proud of. I'd proved a point to my advisor. And I just thought, boy, the amount of stress and fear that's going to go into throwing my name out there on this just isn't worth it. I've already got my accreditation. Thank you, goodbye. Which I will admit is a lazy approach. So for the people who are a little more gung ho than me and fearless than me, perhaps, you know, I think a really good place to start is you're just asking around your department. You know, I got set up with, I was very fortunate. I worked with a guy named Dr. Dan Bain in the Bain lab at the University of Pittsburgh. And he does a lot of GIS stuff. His focus is primarily water flow. So using GIS to sort of model water flow in various places, hence the pipes. But I really got connected with him because first and foremost, him and I get along famously. He used to scare the absolute crap out of me. But you want it's you know, you want to be able someone who like has your best interests at heart. And I will say specifically to kind of the undergraduate audience, and this might not be advice that people love to hear, right? Some people love working with undergraduates because some people are happy to have the, you know, starry-eyed, can-do attitude towards anything, and some people frankly find them to be a hindrance, right? You know, if I'm only going to be working in your lab for a semester, what is it that I can really train Ben to do that's going to get me a return on the investment that I put into training him how to use this? You know, so depending on your specialty, there's going to be sort of like hiccups around what you should scope for yourself, right? And I think that you as a early career researcher, particularly someone really taking their first steps into it, is to be very mindful of scope. You know, the research as it's taught to a lot of people is you're taught the big concepts, the grand concepts. You're not necessarily taught so much of sort of the more granular pieces that get you there. So, you know, you could say like, okay, I want to work doing gel assays in some sort of virus, and I've done that once in lab or something in my chemistry lab, whatever it might be. It's like cool, but you know, to get the expertise that you need to be able to confidently say that will be a scientific result requires a lot of training and time. So, you know, even just getting good at doing those assays themselves is like, if that is a research project for you. You know, if you're someone very early in your career, getting where you can do lab grade assays of something, that is a research project for you. That's not necessarily you doing research on its own sake for yourself, but that is a skill that you can get out of it. And so I think scoping is very, very important for younger people. Not saying I'm not going to invent a new element. I'm not going to cure cancer tomorrow. But what I can do is understand, you know, I want to learn about the research process. You're not, you know, learning about what that means, I think is a lot of the value you'll get out of engaging as an undergrad. And so then, you know, as I said, the next step is finding someone who's really able and willing to support you on that journey. Be fearless and go with your gut. Ask a lot of people. You know, I'm sure by the time you're a sophomore or a junior in your department, you're fairly well acquainted with depending on how big your school is for sure, but you're fairly well acquainted with the who's around your department, who are the friendlier faces, who are the more curmudgeonly faces. And so just have a sense of who it is you can talk to in that regard. You know, you might get rejected. I definitely got rejected a couple times. Just they don't have time for you for that reason. I said it's just there's nothing that we can really do that would be useful for you or for us. That's not a reflection on you. People just have different priorities. Eventually, I found Dan, who's like, you know, yeah, I'm happy. It's a lot of what the value I got was sitting in lab meetings, right, being part of that community and watching other people's work, people who are more advanced in that career's work. So, you know, not necessarily so much worrying about my own project, but seeing, oh, these are the questions that Rob's getting answered each week in lab meeting. You know, these are the sort of figures that he's being asked to make. This is the line of thinking that he's being pushed on. That's much more educational than like, did I do my project this week, next week, right? That's a very good way to start. And to build that relationship up. You know, it's really interesting. I'd say I also, you know, benefit from a number of ways because that community is really useful for you as a researcher. Oftentimes the students who you'll be working in labs with aren't that much older than you, and the master students and the PhD students are often very willing to help you as well because they they're perhaps a little less jaded than their advisors sometimes. And a very direct benefit is a lot of time those master students or PhD students are your lab advisors, or you're like helping out with your classes. So being able to, if you're involved with them and you can have that little personal connection where you can say, hey, like, you really love that help with that, like a little extra explanation on that homework assignment, whatever it might be, was very, very helpful for me. So I had groundwater geology at the same time it was being taught by someone who was being TA'd by someone in my lab, and it was really lovely to get like really good patient explanations from her because she knew that this was important to me and that I was trying. So all that to say, like, a lot of the benefits you'll get out of research aren't necessarily like, I learned to do research, this is the research process. But you'll get those a lot more through observation, and most of that, like, learning of the research process might not necessarily be you doing research yourself.
Well, with research, it's almost interesting, and correct me if you think differently, but that when you're researching something, it's a completely different way of thinking, right? It's like that than like a typical classroom setting, and so you almost get like a whole new world of learning, if that makes any sense. Like it's interesting because you can sort of, like, when you're learning enough or reading literature to do like research on a topic, you can sort of like pick and choose what topics you want to really study and focus on, instead of like in a classroom setting where you're sort of learning like all of it, right? It's like you're learning everything about this topic, right? When you do research, you can just sort of like leapfrog through these different concepts and just pick and choose the things you need to get to the end to some extent, right?
Well, I'd push back on that because,
Feel free.
along that, along whenever in any sort of discovery you do, in any sort, whether that's, I work primarily in business now, whether that's competitive insights, which for people early in their career, usually just, it's a big word that's thrown around that means I clicked around on your website and what looked different. Yeah, it's a big word for that. Is you'll run into things that both support and disagree with what your intuition is, right? Some things are intuitive, some things are completely unintuitive. What you as a researcher need to do is to be able to like figure out which is kind of in the in and the out group there. How many, how many points do I need to prove a point? If I have like 6 pieces of evidence that point towards me one hypothesis and 2 pieces that point in the complete other hypothesis, that doesn't mean I can just ignore those 2 pieces of information. They should be part of my consideration as well. Whether or not I say these are truly outliers and my tool or my measurement was incorrect in this place and it was for whatever variable, that's possible, or it is telling you something that's much more that these pieces of information only exist in poles, right? They only exist in opposite extremes. That's information in of itself. As I can say from my personal experience, like the work that I did was, it's intuitive work. The point being, had you ever walked around on the ground in these places that we were looking at in Pittsburgh, you'd figure out, I was looking at sort of sewage pipe density versus demographic and socioeconomic status. Intuitively, my brain will tell me that the rich people have a higher pipe density, which, indicates better service. 30 people to one pipe is not good. It's why you get bursts and all sorts of things, public health problems that can spring out of that. But, my intuition says I can look at that map on my computer that says, here's the pipe density. I know that that's the rich neighborhood and there's a high pipe density there. That there's a low pipe density here in one of the poor neighborhoods. And I can intuitively know that. But the difference around science is saying I can intuitively know that versus now I can empirically show you that. Right? Like I didn't necessarily learn anything I didn't know doing my research. Wow, that neighborhood for a rich neighborhood has surprisingly poor service. That neighborhood for a poor neighborhood has surprisingly excellent service of its pipes. Didn't really say anything like that. The sad factors all correlated to each other about right. Poorer neighborhoods with, less education, typically neighborhoods that were Black, typically had worse services of pipes. I knew that from walking around Pittsburgh. But that's where you build that foundation, right? You say, so next time you go to a town council meeting, years in the making, you bring your research with you and you say, look, I made this map on my own time that says these citizens who pay taxes just like these citizens, they're not getting equal treatment in their sewage system than these citizens are. And this is you as a city councilman probably know that because you've walked around this neighborhood before, but you cannot deny this proof. And that's the purpose of doing research, right? And to your point around like, that direction of research is you can have your hypothesis, but you should never discount anything that you just dislike and doesn't fit your hypothesis. Every piece of information is valuable.
of course, that's a
So
very good point. And I think the other thing too is like that I think people is a stumbling block, at least for some people doing research, is say like for example, I'm a math student, right? And so when you're doing math problems, right, which are obviously way different than research problems, but when you're doing like math problems, like as in, you know, homework problems, you have your textbook and you do the answers and you fill out the, you know, do like write out all your answers, do all the math, and then you flip to the back of the book and you check the answers and you see if you were right, right? Um, there's the thing with research is that you don't really know sometimes if you're right, and sometimes the answer just doesn't exist, right? Like sometimes you get to the end and it's just like, oh, that was completely nothing, right? Like there's still something you can glean out of it, but it's not like as clear cut as like the answer is 5, right? You know, you got it right or you got it wrong. Oftentimes it's a little surprising, like you said, it's a little bit you have to have an open mind, right? Going into it, you can't like start research with your conclusion already in mind. You can't write the conclusion of the paper and then start the research, right? Yeah.
well, it's funny as well though, because if for sort of taking your math example, right? The pace of mathematics research moves incredibly slowly. You know,
Mhm.
every research field has a relative citation rate that sort of goes along with it, right? So the great example is oncology, cancer research. I could write a paper today, I could publish it today, and I could have 10 citations tomorrow morning, just because there's so much funding behind it. There's so much apparatus to make that information, able to be disseminated, make it accessible to people, to the right people. That I can expect that I can expect that 10 people in my field will have read my paper and might have a relevant use for my paper, in a week or so, which is incredibly fast. It's hyperbole, but still very, very fast. The
Mhm.
most highly cited journal in the world is CAA, Cancer for Clinicians. And then you get to fields like mathematics, where the pace of the research is much, much slower, much, 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 much slower, right? So there's not as many people doing it. So I'm not, Ben and I, instead of working on the same drug towards a different result at the same time, so we can compare our results semi-concurrently when we're published, it's all right. Ben's working on a proof. It's going to take him 3 years to prove or deny it, right? And so it's kind of funny, it's like even in mathematics, right, there's not necessarily like a right or a wrong answer. It just things move so much slower that by the time typically it's accepted as fact, it's been 4 years and it's been under review and it's a pretty ironclad proof.
Mhm.
So not to say that doesn't exist sort of in other fields as well. It's just funny like the speed at which that happens, I think.
That's a really good point. I had actually never thought of it that way. That's a great way to phrase that.
Yeah,
Um,
and it's expectation setting as well, right? So like when you work in publishing, like our primary currency is citations, right? The value, there are many ways to assign value to research for sure, but an easy sort of like, just let's use this as American dollars, is citations. The number of people that read your paper and said, this is I can build on this work. Work is relevant to me, that I can build on it by citing it in my own work. This is a great metric of that. And just based on how many people are in the field are working on it, in mathematics, just not as many, how quickly it takes to sort of review and confirm that information. Again, in mathematics, much longer. And that's sort of what builds up like the sort of the unique identities of these communities, right? So as a publisher, you have to be understanding of that fact, that like Cancer for Clinicians has an impact factor of probably 50 or 70, right? That's the ratio of times it's cited to the number of things it's published, roughly. Mathematics, it might be 0.5. The highest journal in the field might have 1 or something, or 0.5. And you have to understand that those aren't necessarily like equal metrics. And
mhm.
to spin this back to in terms of early career people, like again, you don't have to necessarily be moving the needle. It's more just about understanding about what research in your field of interest looks like, right? So if I'm a math student, I'm going to work on one component of a proof that might not be published until 6 years after I graduated, but I should know I've learned from that experience that is what math research looks like. It's going to be me grinding out a little piece of this much more labyrinthian thing. And that's valuable experience too, because that will help you determine if you are interested in pursuing a career in research in your field, right? As if you understand what that actually means to be a researcher in your field. Um, and I think there's a difference there that, a lot of students, I think it's interesting to educate people on this sort of thing. And is the difference is, I know I want to go and get another degree versus do I want to go be a researcher? Like, I know I'm passionate about applied psychology and I want to go get my master's in applied psychology, but do I want to do research with that? Do I know what it means to be a researcher with applied psychology? That kind of thing.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. I I think there's definitely a big difference there. Yeah, and so I think getting into research at a relatively early age, once you like have the connections to be able to do it, once you have an opportunity to do it, take it, right, and run, and get some experience, right? Give it a shot. And that's sort of what this podcast is all about. So I have one question. I think I'm going to take a bit longer on this section just because it's interesting to get to speak with you on this. So I have one question, and it's going to lead to two questions. The first question is a very abstract question that you will not know the answer to, but I'd just kind of like to hear. In your estimation, how many research papers do you think you've read?
Oh, start to finish or abstracts? Start to finish, I could
both.
probably count, and start to finish. Side of actually, oh gosh, not nearly as many as you might think. Start to finish, probably less than 50. Abstracts, hundreds of thousands of them, hundreds or thousands of them. So I say, the only papers I ever really read start to finish, outside of maybe one that really catches my eye or something that I've published. Remember, sex, drugs, rock and roll always sells. Would be, it's really sort of either stuff I did for my undergrad research or stuff I did for like a scientific technical writing class. Abstracts, hundreds and thousands, but yeah. To interesting point for you, just as like an overview metric for people, right? Like the majority of papers go uncited. It's like 45% of papers or something like that. It's about 50% of papers go uncited.
Wow.
Do you know how many how many research outputs are published per year? How many articles are published per year?
I have no idea.
Across all disciplines?
I couldn't even ballpark it. 2 million?
About 2 million.
That is
2 million pieces of information published, codified, scientified a year. It's a lot.
Mm-hmm. That is a lot. And like when you think about it, there's no way like that ought to be like, I'd say like, what is that? Tens of thousands a day. Like that's a lot of research for, and there's no way that even within your field, there's no way that you could read, even like within a subsection of your field, there's no way that you could read like or keep up on it.
No. And that's the piece that every publisher tries to crack, right? That's the golden ticket for all of us, is how can we make sure in a world where everyone is incentivized by publishing more, everyone, not just the publisher, right? Like I whether it's a for-profit publisher or independent publisher, if you're a researcher, you're incentivized to publish. I mean, it'd be remiss to be on this podcast and not to say, I'm sure you, even at your age, you've heard publish or perish in some form, right? It's the sense that if you are not actively contributing to the literature, what are you doing as a scientist? Whether or not you as a scientist believe that I should spend 5 years refining and perfecting my method and publishing this paper, or I should publish on this paper every 3 months in sort of piecemeal fashion, the scientific community says do it piecemeal because that's how you prove your worth. That's a pretty incredible way to incentivize someone, right? It's just do more. So you end up in a situation where, as you say, there's a knowledge overflow. Even if you're in a small, very niche fields are able to consume all of the information that's relevant to them. But those are very niche fields. Every publisher is interested in, okay, how can we use artificial intelligence and natural language processing and big terms that perhaps older people might not really understand, but understand that it's a buzzword. How can we use that to deliver content that is incredibly relevant to people, right? Like, classic pain point is always saying, I'm a reviewer and I'm always asked to review papers that are outside my scope, right? Like I'm a, whatever the heck it might be, I'm a cardiologist and I keep getting papers on respiratory functions. It's like, clearly this isn't my area of expertise. Great way to make someone never want to work for you again. And so there's all of these things. It's like, okay, how can we make sure that people who are most interested in reading the stuff are getting the stuff they're most interested in reading? And how can the people who are doing reviews make sure they're only reviewing content that they're really interested in? How can we get people who, making sure that every person is only getting the most best of the research that's being published, which again just becomes a monumental task when you're putting out about 2 million research outputs a year, on top of all the historical knowledge that's come before you.
Yeah. And yeah, no, you're right. That's why don't we
If you
sort
have,
of transition a little bit?
I was gonna say, if you have
Because we
answers
are,
for it, you can make a lot of money.
yeah, yeah, that's true. So let's transition a little bit because I'm actually kind of fascinated now a little bit about your your journey in publication, in the publication field. How'd you get into publication? And like I know you said that you knew you didn't want to go into a, say, a more research or more education path. What made you choose publication?
Sure. So we call it scholarly communications, academic publishing, whatever the heck you wanted to call it.
Sure.
And I recognize it's a fairly obscure field in the sense that it's like, hey, I'm a doctor, I'm a nurse. Okay, I can get a pretty good sense of what your 9 to 5 looks like. Did you see the patients? Did you administer the drugs? Did you well that? Um, Publishing is an interesting one because it's something no one's really ever heard of, but it works behind the scenes. It's fortunately I come from a family of publishers. My mom works in publishing as well, so I was fortunate enough to sort of like know of the field that it existed. I think that is true for many people. And if I may go on a caveat here, particularly like as an industry, we're an industry that struggles with hiring people of color for myriad reasons. A lot of it comes down to that understanding, right? Like we're not doing book fairs and the places, for job fairs and the places we should be doing to get those folks. There's another factor around this has been brought up at multiple companies that I've worked at is it's not a very it's not a high paying industry. So for example, when I graduated college and I started working in publishing, I was able to live with my parents, right? I was in Boston, incredibly expensive city. And had my parents not been willing to put me up, I wouldn't have been able to take that job, right? Like being able to have that baseline of privilege is a level of like accessibility into the career. Another piece is, typically, again, broad strokes here is if you're a person of color and you're one of the first people of your family to go to college and you've got a good education that can open up a well-paying job for you, are you going to use that job to become whatever, like an engineer that's going to make you 6 figures, or you can use that job to go and live with your parents so that you can pursue a career in publishing, right? Like the value prop isn't very good there. So just to say, that's something that folks who listen to this, just to be aware of it, something that struggles with the industry, and as an obscure industry, it's one that's an issue we struggle with too. But I was fortunate enough to be aware of the industry going into it. Boston, and again, it's very much constrained to major cities. The company I work for is based in Toronto. I live in Philadelphia, which has 3 of the other major publishers, has offices of 3 other major publishers in it. And we hope that that's changing. As the world gets more adapted to working from home, I can tell you that I can do my job from absolutely anywhere, and it won't really be impacted by that location. So we hope that people start to see that change too, so that we can bring in, people who've been traditionally kind of phased out of publishing by having to live at a high cost of living city, having to, be constrained to these 9 to 5 on the East Coast time kind of things. But honestly, anyway, long-winded way, I started as an intern. I knew that the company existed. I knew to look for applications online. Fortunately, I was accepted. I think one thing that's particularly attractive is I have a background in science. Many people who work in publishing, many people who work in publishing, my oldest brother included. My oldest brother now works for Penguin Random House, but he started in scholarly publishing as well. A lot of people end up saying, all right, I want to go work in trade publishing. I want to publish the next great American novel or whatever it might be, only to realize the money just isn't there. The jobs aren't there, right? So that's like a real thing too. You get a lot of like liberal arts kids, white privileged liberal arts kids who end up being washed into publishing, thinking that they're going to make this step into trade publishing, which can happen for some if you're lucky, but it's very, very limiting if that's really what it is that you intend to do. So I never had that hang up. I was fortunate there. I was easy to be the grindstone on my career when I got in. People are really important. The people who you start your career with are really important. And I think I was actually talking to someone on the plane last week when I was on my way back from Toronto about how, when you start your career, when you finish school, you're going to be in a situation where you move from being at least that's how I found myself, graded A to D. A is excellent, B is you did okay, C is you got to do better, D is come on, like pull it together, right? And and you get held against that rubric for 16 years, and it's very easy to appraise yourself along that rubric. I know what it means; it's intuitive to us. When you graduate, that doesn't exist anymore. You have to feel comfortable that you are doing a good job with what you're doing, right? Like I'm confident that I wake up, I send the right emails, I talk to people, I move the wheels and get stuff going. And so it's important to have a boss that's like willing to understand you, that you're in that stage of life, and help you there. And so I was really, really lucky to have a guy named Bart Watzek, who's you won't find him on LinkedIn, I promise you, but he's been in publishing for 20, 30 years. He's got keen mind for business, and was incredibly invested in me and my other sort of earlier career colleagues in developing us. And so we Wiley is primarily known as a society publisher. So there's proprietary titles that Wiley has launched and owns the copyright for, and then society titles. So for example, the biggest one that Wiley publishes is the American Geophysical Union, the AGU. It's a contract that, I mean, is a massive contract, massive contract. The AGU covers space, earth, rocks, all of it. And if the physical sciences, the AGU covers it. So it's a massive contract, and they publish on their behalf. So as an organization, Wiley had recently, before I joined, decided to split those two businesses in half. Previously, everything was booked by subject. So whether or not it was a title that Wiley owned in igneous petrology, whether it was the AGU title, it didn't matter. It would all be working on the same person. They divided to split by ownership. So proprietary titles under subject would be with me, and society titles under subject would be with someone else. And the thinking being that if you have a society partner, that is much more of a service relationship. I have signed a contract with the society that says I will provide Ben with X, Y, and Z every fiscal year. He will get marketing support. He will get a number of discount codes to promote an event, whatever the heck that might be. We'll write that agreement out. And a lot of the time, it's frankly money, right? Like we will pay you this, we will give you this flat amount of cash to publish on your behalf because we believe we can make money publishing your journal. So Wiley has a reputation for being a society publisher, and they had just split them. So my boss worked in the proprietary title. So a lot of the people said, oh, like Wiley's society publisher, a lot of big jazzy names over on that side. I want to go work over there. What that does is it very much packs many people into a room, which means there's not very much opportunity for those people in that same room. The other thing is as well, because if you own the titles, such as we did in the proprietary titles, you can tell people what you want to do, right? Like the society owns the journal, and you have to say, yes, society, we would love to do this on your behalf. At the end of the day, I sign your, editor-in-chief, I sign your paycheck. You have to do what it is that I tell you to do. So you get much more control over the sort of the strategy of the things you want to do. You can say, these are the papers we want to target. These are the subjects we want to be targeting this year. These are the events we want to be speaking at. And you have to do it because you have signed a contract, as rude as that is, American as that is, I guess. You've signed a contract that says you have to, and I can wave that at you and you will do it. So I was very lucky to join sort of at that time when that split had just happened. So there's a lot of opportunity available for people like me who are willing to work in that space. And I was very, very lucky to be supported by Bart and my other colleagues at Wiley, who sort of recognized that opportunity and recognized my potential and sort of pushed me to do so. So I ended up, I started as an intern. I ended up supporting about 40 journals as an assistant, and ended up managing about 5 on top of the 40 that I supported by the time that I left. And I was really lucky. I mean, the thing I enjoy most about this job is talking to researchers and meeting people that I wouldn't meet otherwise. Across all, I worked a lot in oncology when I was at Wiley, and it's not necessarily an area of interest for me personally, but it's very interesting to meet people who like, what's your life story? How come you threw your life into oncology? What was it about this field that makes you tick? And I was lucky enough to have a lot of discretion on who it was that I wanted to talk to. So I was, there's not many entry-level positions where you get to set your own travel schedules, so I got to go to San Diego. Cleveland's a little less glamorous, but got to go to Cleveland. I was very, 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 very lucky to be able to do that. And that really sort of like kept that passion up, that it's about the people, it's about talking to people and making sure that people understand that, I said at the beginning of this, publishing is a black box, but there are people behind that black box who like genuinely care about making science better and more accessible for people. And that's sort of always how I've tried to kind of navigate myself.
So going off that black box, we do have about, 15 minutes left. I would love to hear you kind of break down that barrier of that black box. And for somebody who is like, you know, a younger audience, just getting started in publishing, maybe they've written their manuscript, they've submitted it. What happens? What happens in that black box?
For sure. It's funny. It's a good question. It's one, you know, I'm at the age where I've got kids and sorry, kids. Well, I don't have kids. I have friends finishing up med school, right? So a lot of that is I've got one publication. I'm looking at where I want to apply for residency, and this getting published, it'll be a big part of my application to residency. It shows that I have interest and desire to pursue this area academically. And so I need to get this paper published in time, right? Like I get this published quickly so that I can list it on my applications. There's a lot of frustrations that someone in your position might run into, Ben. The first one is identifying a journal. What journal is the right fit for you? You know, is it, you know, with all due respect, you're probably not going to be publishing in Nature anytime soon. You know, we literally did it. We fixed cancer. You know, we did it. That's the journal where you're going to see it, right? It's going to be in Nature, so it's okay. So short of us Nature, where are we going to publish? Haven't cured cancer yet. So all right, that's the whole thing. Most people, if you're in your master's and PhD kind of level, have an advisor that can help them, right? They say, okay, where do you publish, Dr. Federick? You know, what's always been the journal? That's how so much of this business works. It's like, well, I had a good experience here and I had a bad experience here, so that's what I'm going to tell my students. My students now are going to pass that on to their students, and so on, so on, so on. That's how you build your reputation. That's sort of my position, what you're trying to intercept, to make sure that they're saying the nice things about you. So short of that, you can hit the internet, right? You can hit Google, you can hit places like ResearchGate, try and find your community online if you don't necessarily have an advisor. You know, hope at this point you would have someone who'd be willing to help you, like a Dr. Bain or something, someone who's willing to say, yeah, this is not a good journal. But then you run into a lot of other issues. One of them is, okay, I am on a deadline. I have to get my manuscript approved or published in the next 6 months so that I can meet this application that I need to do. A lot of journals, some do, and it's becoming a more increasing trend on the thing called DORA. If you're a DORA signatory, Directory of Open Research Assessment. Open Research Assessment is the ORA thing. So it says, you know, if you sign up for it, you're saying, okay, I will put my information online. So time to first decision is on my journal homepage. Okay, you can wait 2 weeks, time to first decision, whatever. Problem is, typically, if those pages, if those are displayed, they're probably quite good times, in which case it's probably quite a good journal. If they're not displayed, that's honestly the majority of journals. But you have absolutely no idea what that time could be. Some journals, you know, it could be months for you to get a first decision, and that first decision could be no, right? You're not really kept in the loop in the meantime that says, we're looking at your paper. Your paper's in, you know, yours is next in the queue, Ben. We're going to look at it next. It could just wait and wait and wait, and no one's in contact with you. It's entirely on you, the author, to follow up and say, dear editor, dear whoever's in charge of the journal, where's my paper? Where's my paper? Where's my paper? So that's the first stumbling point. It's just timing, not knowing where to put it, and the timing to get it back. The other point is, you know, you end up oftentimes with your paper gets accepted, or they say, yes, your paper gets accepted with minor revisions, right? And it says, we think your paper would be improved by adding these sites, you know, adding these sources if you address these points. Very good. It's a very important part. The peer review is very important. There's also, you know, there's the black box of, in often cases, blinded peer review. You don't know who is giving you that feedback. Sometimes it comes out really nasty, right? It's your first paper. It's your best effort at it. Compared to someone who's been doing this for 20 years, yeah, it's not going to be as good at it, but like, you shouldn't have to suffer insult for that. And some people do, right? So if I'm an old hoity-toity doctor and I don't recognize your name, and I'm in the field and I think I'm chief, you know, so knowledgeable about the field, I know anyone and everyone who's worth publishing on, it's very easy for me to be dismissive of you. Oh, Ben Federick, never heard of him, didn't like his paper, just going to say it's bad, and I'm not going to give him feedback that's going to be constructive. You know, I'll say one of the things I really enjoy about working at JMIR is honestly our brand. A lot of our brand is built on giving good feedback. We won't always say we'll publish a paper, but we'll tell you what's wrong with it, and we'll do it in a constructive way. We'll say, hey, this would be improved by this because it would, you know, expand your methods and make sure results more clear, that how you came to your results, whatever that feedback might be. There's a very specific way to give that versus just being dismissive and shitty to someone. That's a problem that a lot of people run into, a lot of particularly early career researchers. In smaller fields, there's also the risk of, I'm in such a small field that people recognize my name, right? So it's like this person knows who I am because they can see the byline on the submitted. I don't know who they are, and they don't like me, because I gave them a bad review or I said something about that I disagreed with their work at a conference once. They can spite punish me for that. So cool. That's something that you might run into as well. And then there's the issue of, okay, that's been, you've done it, you've revised your manuscript, and it's been accepted. Great. It's going to be accepted for publication. You don't necessarily, most people will tell you when that is. It should probably be about 2 weeks from when they say, yes, your paper is accepted to when you see it online. Some journals, that's not true. So you'll have to look up that specific journal's policy, right? And again, this is a key thing overlining. This is journal by journal. This can all be different. So there's not one centralized workflow that you can expect that'll be like, yes, this one should be 3 months, 2 months, 3 months here. No, it'll vary by journal by journal. And, by the end of it, you've waited who knows how many months. You're not really sure who's touching your paper at any given point. And then it gets sent to copy editing, which this is why I think when I say black box, I think specifically, and again, these are my opinions, not reflective of anyone, but the large corporate publishers, right? It's much easier to make money. They are profit driven, and it's much easier to make money on someone if they're being bamboozled, right? If they don't really know what's going on. So you end up in, so it's the next page, your paper's accepted. Now it goes to copy editing. It's frankly because of, business reasons. It's going to go somewhere in Singapore or India to, there's a couple of like major companies that service pretty much the 4 largest publishers. And, those folks they're like lovely folks, but they are told to work to a rubric specifically. They're incredibly inflexible. They are told that they are replaceable, right? It's like if your metric is process 40 papers a day and do it to these strict guidelines, and if you don't process those 40 papers a day, you will be fired. You're just going to do whatever the guidelines say, even if it doesn't make sense, right? So you as an author are now very frustrated because you've gotten your proof back 3 times. You've sent this 3 times, Ben. 3 times you've sent the proof. And you've said, hey, I don't know why you keep fixing this figure. It's very much supposed to be like this. Like, please don't mess with the colors. The color is very important because it indicates that this disease is present or this bacterium is present versus whatever the heck else it might be. Like, please stop editing my figures. But that person's rubric says edit figures to fit this certain way. So you've done that 4 times. You've gone back 4 times with this person now, and every time they send you your proof wrong. And so eventually you have to get someone else. You have to get the journal manager involved and say, hey, they're just not editing my proofs up to as I keep telling them to do it. And then that's a whole separate conversation that the editor has to have around, okay, now I have to approve that this is a non-standard submission or whatever the heck they want to call it. And so through the end of that, and by the end of that, you'll be published, right? But it's like pulling teeth the entire way. You don't really know where your paper is. You don't really know who's touching it. You don't really know who has looked at it and provided the feedback or done the typesetting or done the, it's all service at email addresses. And so the other piece of this is the actual black box in terms of the payment of it, like how people what behooves you to make money. And from the publishers, large, profit-driven for-profit publishers, that comes in the form of, well, many different ways, many different ways. A sort of obvious one is just we charge you as a large publisher. Your library pays a subscription to subscribe to our journals. It's a Netflix style deal. You either get them all or you don't get any of them. You don't get to pick. Sorry. So even if you are, even if you're the Thunder Bay Institute of Osteopathic Medicine, right? It's like, we're not just going to sell you osteopathic papers. We're going to sell you, Roman history as well, because we can. And so, that's a really good, and because the people in your, the physicians at the Thunder Bay Osteopathic Clinic will go, we cannot afford, we need nature, osteopathic medicine. Anything big that will be published or any big major breakthrough that comes through will be published in that journal, and we'll be caught, with our pants down if we can't get access to that paper. We'll look like schmucks at the conference because we don't know what the latest technique, the latest tool, whatever that is being used in the field is. So you, as the librarian at the Thunder Bay Osteopathic Medicine Center, have to say, well, I have to pay for that. I have to pay for medicine, right? I have to pay for nature. I have to pay for that title. My surgeons need it. Even if I don't need any of these other papers that are coming with it, any of the other journals that are coming with it, they need that one. So I would argue that that's coercive. There's also the version of it's coercive where you end up, I'm not sure how familiar you are with open access publishing. I work for an entirely open access publisher. And the difference is, so at the end of this as well. So Ben, have you gone the traditional publishing route? At the end of this, you've signed your copyright over. The last step of it is thank you for your paperwork. Thank you for your manuscript. It's wonderful. you have given us your work for free, right? Your work has been given to us for free, and you've signed the copyright over. You said I can use this, I can use my figures when I go talk to my colleagues, I can present on this, but you own the copyright. I have a right to use it, but you own the copyright. And it ends up in a situation where you go, okay, I've done this work. I, Ben, have done, let's just say I've been doing, again, gel assays, right? And I've been doing in a lab that has been paid for by my university. I've been, the reagents were paid for by the state, whatever, like I am a government researcher, right? So my salary is paid for by the state. And I have now been made to make both my research, what was paid for by government money, and my salary, which is paid for by government money, I put it behind a paywall by signing over the copyright to someone. We're hoping that there are practices, moving to open access is moving away from that. It's moving so that, okay, if you've done that research, the public, even if they're not interested in it, should have a right to access that because they've paid for it, right? It is public money that being used for public research. Most people aren't going to read it, but those who care about it should be able to. And so then another really good way to make money is like we publish fully open access at JMIR. So every paper you can read available, you pay that fee up front. You pay essentially just say a couple $1,000s to, you retain the copyright, you release the copyright to the world, right? So we don't get to do that anymore. But what's really good is there are journals that are called hybrid journals. And this is a personal pain point for me, where, okay, you can pay an APC to make your article available, just this article. The rest of the journal is still behind the paywall. So let's say we publish in a given year, you and I publish 100 papers in our journal, in our what's called a hybrid title, hybrid gold title. We have pure gold OA titles, and then there's hybrid titles. The hybrid title says, okay, we've published 100 papers this year. 30 of those papers were published open access, right? So that means that even if you and I are not subscribing to them, we can go access them. Okay, so when we go to the library next year and we say we need to renegotiate how much you're going to pay on your subscription fee, what you think would happen would you say, okay, yeah, we love that. We love Journal X, published 100 papers last year, and we noticed that 30 of them were open access. So we'd like to only spend 70% of what we paid last year when 0 of them were open access, right? Like, why am I paying for something that I already can get for free that someone has already paid? And the large publishers will say, oh, this is why hybrid journals are evil. They'll say, oh, that's a very good point. But actually, instead of it costing, it was $1,000 for 100 of these papers, and now 30 of them are freely available. So instead of $700, which should be your rate, which is the one-to-one mathematical rate, it's going to be more like $850. And we're not really going to tell you that calculation, right? We're just going to say, well, based on our calculations, this should be the fee. This is the fee. This is the new subscription fee, bearing in mind that we have 10%, 20%, 30% of the content is now available. That's a very good way to skim money off the top, right? And it's double dipping. Someone has paid a couple $1,000s for that paper to be open access to you, the publisher. So for you to them pay them over what the paywall should be to get more money on it, which is like pretty unethical, I would argue.
Yeah.
But that whole point of that goes to the black box point, is like no one really understands. Researchers don't fully understand what it is that's going into their APC, their article publication charge, right? Why does it cost what it costs? What is the cost? Like, and many people can't explain that cost, and so it becomes very easy just to say the cost is what the cost is. It's a good journal, so the APC is high. Well, yes, but does it have to be this high? Could it be lower? Could it be cheaper for these people who are a marginalized community, whatever that means? So that's a very good way to make money, and is a good illustration of the black box of publishing.
Yeah, thank you for breaking that down. That was really awesome. We are getting close to time. Any last pieces of advice for young people? How about this? What's one piece of advice that you think is important, but that is not cliched? That is that a student might have never heard before.
Oh, specifically related to research?
Just for someone who's interested in getting into research, one thought or one piece of advice. Sure.
Papers with the most boring titles might do you the most good. By that I mean, if you're really earnestly curious in the subject you're going to get into, I can recommend, as I will to anyone, the Dimensions tool at dimensions.ai. It's a freely available, look it up. It's just fun. It's cool. So you say you're curious. You'll say, oh man, I'm curious what the best, most interested, highly cited, what the most tweeted, like if I'm curious what Twitter's interested in, Twitter, what the paper in the journal of interest I'm in, I can look that up. I can look that by my field as well. So I may not have to read all 100 of the best manuscripts, but I can read the top 3. And to my point around the most boring titles, right? Like systematic reviews or literature reviews, you're not going to find necessarily wonderful, groundbreaking science discoveries in them. But what you will find is names of people who are currently in your field, right? Who is being cited, who's important enough that if I'm going to do a review of the literature on a subject, whose work do I need to be citing? It'll give you a good review, will give you the rundown of the for and the against points, right? So if you're really interested in just sort of like, I'm interested in this subject, but I don't know if I want to, read 30 papers on it, go and look at the literature, find a good literature review. And heck, if you have someone who's if you have an advisor or you've been talking to someone who's interested in you being an advisor, I'm sure that they can very quickly point you to what they consider like the seminal review in their field, right? And that's always a good starting point. There's always going to be a seminal paper or a seminal review. It's a good place to start there.
Well, in that case, thanks for the advice and thanks for the talk. Yeah, that was a really great conversation.
Yeah, my pleasure. I just, I'm passionate about scholarly communications, and if folks want to reach out to me if they have questions, I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow up with me.
And I'll, if you want to send those my way, I will make sure to throw them in the description of, whatever they're watching it on.
Sure thing. Awesome. Cool.
Awesome. Thanks. Gonna stop.
All right.